Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. We have a big crowd. This book is about the 5 traditions of Asian values: Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Zen. And not just as an I haven't read it yet, but I think it's not just as an interpersonal or spiritual thing, but how these ethical systems can help make a better society. So here's Michael Brannigan from St. Rose to tell us about his book, Striking a Balance.
Thanks for coming. I had a wonderful experience in September speaking with you, and I enjoyed that thoroughly. And it's nice to see you back and to see new faces. Thanks very much for coming. And we'll talk a bit about my book, Striking a Balance. But every book, well, I think most books, are biographies in a sense, sort of confessions. And this book is especially the case. Now, even though I have the last name Brannigan, do I look Irish to you? Raise your hands if you think so. My Irish cousins didn't think I looked Irish when I went to visit them. My father's from there, and my mother is from Japan. And I myself was born in Japan. I was born in the southern island called Kyushu, in a town called Fukuoka, which the traditional name is Hakata, known for the famous Hakata dolls, little wooden dolls. And Hakata actually was one of the targets of the atom bomb, but the cloud was it was bad. And the plane that dropped the bomb went over to Nagasaki. So the town now is Fukuoka. But I was born in Japan. My father was a GI. He was stationed in Korea during the Korean War, stationed in Japan during the Korean War. And he met my mother. And you know what happened, right? After that, lust takes over. And I was a product of that lust. Even though my father knew no Japanese and my mother knew no English, they somehow connected. And I was a result of that connection, and so were my 2 twin sisters, my identical twins. And we were stationed in Japan for about 4 years. In fact, when my mother married my father, a gaijin, the Japanese word gaijin means red-bearded foreigner, she was disbarred. She was immediately expelled from her family. So we had to live on an army base. And then my father spent his time there on the base. And after 4 years, we went to Newport, Rhode Island, where my father's family settled. Because if you've ever been to Newport, Rhode Island, there's a lot of rich people there, and the Irish work for the rich people. So my grandparents worked in some of the mansions there. So my background is a sort of hybrid. I've always been personally interested in whether or not and to what degree strangers can understand each other. Whether or not and to what degree I can understand and be understood by the other. By the other. The other that's sitting next to you now, because each one of us here is the other. Or the more explicit other, the other who looks different, who dresses differently, who speaks differently. I've always been intrigued by that question. Whether or not, and to what extent, we can understand the other. And I believe, in my deepest heart, that it is only through the other that we can have some glimpse of who we are. It is only through the other that we can learn more about ourselves. And this book is not just a book about others, about Hindus and Buddhists and Confucians and Taoists and Zen Buddhists. It's a book which is a quest for ourselves about who we are. Who are we? Because I believe we can learn so much from the other. So can we understand someone who is not who we are? And that is pretty much one of the biggest challenges we face today, more so than ever. So what I will do is pick out certain ideas in the book. I won't take you through a tour of the book. That's pretty boring. But I will pick out certain sections and look at the different traditions and see how what they teach us may teach us about this thing called balance. This thing called balance. And balance is, in our current lexicon, balance is not a popular word. We're much more drawn to the extremes. We've always been. We've always been drawn to the extremes. But today especially, we seem to be much more engaged in those either-or positions, for and against, black and white, high and low, good and bad. We're much more in the Zoroastrian universe today than say 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Maybe it's easier. It's the easier path. But let's take some of these ideas here. And I'm going to give us a story, because I think that parables or stories are good ways to get a handle on profound ideas. And the best teachers are always the ones, right? Gandhi, Jesus of Nazareth, Martin Luther King, they always spoke in parables. The Buddha. So picture two monks. Two monks are walking along a road. Now in the Buddhist sutra, these are Buddhist monks. But let's say they're monks. And one's older than the other. And they're instructed by their rules not to look at women. Across the road, they see this young woman about to walk into a pond, a puddle of mud. So the older monk immediately goes across the road, carries the woman across the pond, across the mud, getting his feet all muddied, but she's fine, and then gently places her down back on the road. And he goes back to join his young friend. So they walk for about a mile, 2 miles. Finally, the young monk couldn't hold it in any longer. He finally said, "How could you do this? How could you do that?" Do what? How could you violate our rule? You not only looked at another woman, you picked her up. You touched her. And the old monk looked at the young monk and said, "Listen, I put her down 2 miles back. Why are you still carrying her?" You see? That's the idea of attachment. And whether or not we can be free from attachment. Attachment to ideas, attachment to people, attachment to relations, attachment to a cause, attachment to material things, especially with the holidays coming around, attachment to stuff. This is the season of stuff. Attachment to things. Can we be free of that? These are dangerous attachments. And as we all know, probably the most dangerous attachment is the attachment to an idea. takes us over. And I believe that the traditions in the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, have that core commonality there, is that they share in this idea that balance can only come about if we are able to free ourselves from those self-imposed chains of attachment. Only we can free ourselves from those self-imposed chains because they're self-imposed. Only we can free ourselves. This is an idea in Hinduism, it's an idea in Buddhism, Confucianism, and certainly in Taoism. So that's sort of the running theme here, right? Balance through healthy detachment. So let's look at Hinduism. How many here are familiar with Hinduism? Okay. Some of us are much more familiar than I am. I'm only an academic. To really know something, you have to live it, to experience it, to be engaged in it. So I'm looking at it more intellectually. Hinduism is one of the richest traditions, and probably one of the most important books in Hindu thought is a chapter in the Mahabharata, which is one of the oldest epic poems in the world. The Mahabharata is the Hindu epic about the creation and the history of the world. And it's a theme that we're familiar with. Cousins against cousins, brother against brother, fighting each other over territory, trying to rectify injustice. And we have the brothers on one side, the Pandavas, who've had their kingdom stolen from them. We have the cousins on the other side, the Kauravas, whose father is the blind king Dhritarashtra. And they're having this struggle. And that's human history, right? Struggle, which basically is brother against brother, cousin against cousin, kin against kindred. And we come to this one chapter, which we call the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord. And Arjuna, who's one of the greatest warrior at that time, he's one of the Pandavas. It's now the eve of battle. So let me read from you. I will read to you my description of that, because I open up each chapter with a story. As pennants curl in the wind, and the trumpet-like sounds from conch shells fill the air, the great warrior Arjuna is about to lead his 4 Pandava brothers and their armies into the long-awaited battle against the imposing forces of the Kauravas. After suffering a bitter 14-year exile, Arjuna and the Pandavas face their opportunity now to regain their rightful rule of the kingdom. However, he's all of a sudden stung with a gut-wrenching realization. The Kauravas are his cousins. If he leads his forces into battle, all of them, cousins, dear friends, respected elders, former teachers, all of them will taste death. On the other hand, if he does not fight, he not only shamefully abdicates his duty as a warrior, but he fails to rectify the injustices inflicted on his immediate family. Utterly despondent, he agonizes over what he should do. We now read on as he confesses his confusion to his friend and charioteer Krishna, who happens to be the god Vishnu in disguise. And that's how the Bhagavad Gita, that's what that's all about. Arjuna, on the eve of battle, now is stung with conscience and wondering, should he fight? If he fights, bloodshed, death, the destruction of teachers, cousins. So he confesses this agony, this conscience conflict to his charioteer, Krishna. And he does not know it, but Krishna is the god Vishnu in disguise, come back in human form. And Vishnu now, or Krishna, tries to persuade Arjuna that he has to do his duty. It's his duty as a warrior. And the logic, the philosophical reasoning, just doesn't cut it with Arjuna. He says, for instance, well, you think we're all going to die tomorrow. We're not going to die. There'd be dead bodies. But you and I know that the soul can never die. The soul can never be destroyed. That doesn't work with Arjuna. Krishna says, well, you're a warrior. You have to do your duty as a warrior. Doesn't work with Arjuna. Well, just think of how your family would feel ashamed knowing that you did not do your duty as a warrior. There would be shame brought upon the family. That's a powerful argument. But that still doesn't work with Arjuna. The only way that Krishna can convince Arjuna is this. He realizes he has to disclose his true identity. You see, he's been deceitful all along. Arjuna does not know he's a god. So in a blinding light, in this beautiful moment in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna displays who he is in a blinding light. And both sides see the light. They don't know what's going on in this conversation. And scholars now will enter into all kinds of commentary about really what happened. But this is what I think happened. This is my interpretation. Arjuna confronts the identity of Krishna. Krishna reveals himself. And in the process of Krishna revealing himself, Arjuna awakens to himself. And Arjuna realizes that all along he's been looking at this through human eyes and not through the eyes of the divine. Because who he is, in essence, is divine, is God. And he's been dealing with this whole quandary with the small eyes of a human. What Zen Buddhists would say, they'll say, it's like a frog who looks at the pond with frog's eyes. You only understand everything through frog's eyes. Arjuna awakens to his identity as Atman, as God, as immortal. And he realizes in that split second, in a second that probably seems to last for all eternity, he realizes that he must do his duty and not be attached to the results of his actions. It's a very profound idea because this story can be taken on many levels. Now, we've heard of Mahatma Gandhi, right? Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi was an absolute pacifist. Gandhi was fully inspired by this work, which is interesting because here we have a story in which Krishna is urging Arjuna to do his duty, which means to fight. So an interesting question is, how can a pacifist find this as justification? And my interpretation, and there are other scholars' interpretations on this, but I think we can look at the conflict in various ways. The most basic conflict is inner, it's interior. It's the interior conflict. And I think that's what the Bhagavad Gita is all about, the internal warfare within us. So, this is what happens. Arjuna is not aware of who he is. How does he find out who he is? Through the other's revelation. Through the other's self-revelation, Arjuna awakens to his identity. And it goes back again to what I said earlier, is it? The other can awaken in us more of who we know about ourselves. That's a very profound story, the Bhagavad Gita. And that's how I start the book. In fact, I start every one of my chapters, as I said, with a story. Because I think the stories are a nice way to hook us into the more difficult, metaphysical, profound teachings. So Hinduism is rich and is impossible, absolutely impossible for me to do it any justice in the few minutes I have. But to summarize, what we so far know is that Hindus teach us that every one of us is immortal. Every one of us is Atman. Every one of us is soul. Now notice I said is soul. Did I say we have a soul? No. Every one of us is soul. We have a body. We can only have that which is not what we are. I have a book. I am soul. You know, we in the West, we may say differently. I have a soul. But I, in essence, am my soul. That's what the Hindus teach. And not only that, not only am I, in essence, my soul, I, in essence, am divine. My soul, Atman, who I am, is in essence Brahman, the universal soul. Now, that's an incredibly radical teaching. You see, we know the fate of Christians in the Middle Ages who taught that we are God. What happened to them? They were burned at the stake. We could still be burned at the stake in other ways. Savonarola was so heretical in his idea that I am God, I am God. And in fact, they dug up his ashes and they burned his ashes even over again. I mean, that's how heretical it is, to believe that I am God. Because in Christian and Judaic and Islamic teachings, there's an immense gulf between my humanness, who I am, and the divine. But in Hindu teachings, the most radical teaching in Hinduism is that there is this oneness in essence. That's a very difficult idea for us to grasp. Very difficult. But that's a very important idea in Hinduism. Here's another idea, and I talk about this. I'm picking out ideas now that seem somewhat distinct from the way we think. The idea of 4 stages in life's way. Growing old in America is not fun. And I know that. We do anything to look not old. And I believe that the reason for that is because we as a culture, we value youthfulness and we value productivity. Now granted, we can have an 80-year-old who's youthful and we admire her because of her youthfulness. But see, what's happening is we're admiring youthfulness. In other words, we do not value aging as a good thing in and of itself. We do not give an intrinsic value to aging. Value that we give is more instrumental. If we look at the Hindu stages in life, the first stage is the student stage, the stage my students are in. And a lot of us are still in that stage. It's the never-ending stage when we learn, and not just learn about how to make money, but learn the more important things, at least in Hinduism, the most important thing being spiritual, to find out who we are. That's the most important quest in Hinduism, is to find out who you are. Why is that so complicated? Well, because for the Hindus, we think we're other than who we are. We think we're bodies. We think we have something to do. My identity has something to do with what I own, with the house I live in, with the car I drive, with my attachments. See, so we go through our existence with a mistaken identity. And what the Hindus say is that we have to awaken to who we are, just as Arjuna had to do so. But that's why we come back over and over and over again until we get it right. Because if we don't get it right, we come back and we're reborn over and over and over again, you see? We're on this samsaric wheel of birth, death, life, life, rebirth, etc., until we get it right. Getting it right means finding out who we are. And that's what the student stage is all about, is realizing that's what we have to do. But that's a student stage, which is intellectual. The second stage is the householder stage, when students leave school and they become responsible for other people. They realize that they have to look out for other people's well-being. That's the householder stage. A lot of us have gone through that stage and are going through that stage, right, with children. People for whom we're responsible. And then when our children leave the nest, we say, or they leave and they're able to be on their own, we call that. The Hindus say now we're free enough to enter the forest dweller stage. Now that does not mean that we literally go into the forest. It's all metaphorical. The forest represents the retreat, the solitude, the quiet that we've missed out on all these years. And believe me, right, we sorely need that forest. We need more forests, not malls. We need more forests. The solitude. There's a value to the solitude, because it's in that solitude that we can finally come to terms with what's most important to us, to reconnect with what's most important, the forest dweller stage. And then finally, there's the sannyasin, or the hermit stage. When later in life, when I know my end is coming, when my end is coming nearer, then I begin to be much more interior and much more connected with what matters to me, you see? Now in those last two stages, the forest dweller and the hermit stage, there's that bundle of insight and that bundle of wisdom that I've inherited and that I've learned. And that's the wonder and the blessing that I have to share, because I'm older. So in the Hindu 4 stages, aging is a good thing, because when we get older, we acquire wisdom, hopefully. Wisdom does not just come from experience, but from reflection upon the experience. So we acquire that wisdom, hopefully, and we can be teachers and models to others. There's something beautiful in the intergenerational, living intergenerationally. In our country, that's more difficult to find. We get older and we kind of flock to Florida or to Arizona, and we kind of fend for ourselves. You know, we migrate south. It's much more difficult because we do not place an inherent intrinsic value to aging in our culture. So that's another face of Hinduism in which we can learn something, and perhaps learn something about who we are. Now, enough of that. Let's talk about Buddhism. You cannot understand Buddhism unless you know Hinduism. Why? Because Hinduism is the root of Buddhism. The Buddha himself was a Hindu, the Brahman. It was not called Hinduism then, but it was the Brahmana religion, the Brahmanic tradition. And we know the story of Siddhartha, the young man, right? Don't rely on the movie. the young Buddha, Keanu Reeves. Please don't rely on that. But I would recommend Hermann Hesse's book, Siddhartha, because he gives a nice fictionalized account of the young Buddha. We know the story, the legends around the Buddha, all kinds of legends. As a young man, he left his family, his wife, his son, wanting to look for something that was missing in his life. He had it all. He had it all. He was born into a high caste. He had opulence, affluence. His father tries to protect him from the outside world, but he knows there's something missing, so he needs to find it for himself. And he's on this journey, and he joins these wandering ascetics who practice fasting, and he finds that doesn't get anywhere. All he does is lose weight, you know. So then he's so exhausted at some point. He's so exhausted, he leaves the group. He passes out under this huge tree called the Bodhi tree. Falls asleep, and the legend, one of the legend is a maiden from town offers gods to at the tree by placing food there. And she comes across this young, emaciated man. So she places some yogurt and some foods there for him. Upon awakening, he drinks. He sees the food. He just ravishes that. He feels great. He hangs out under the tree. You know, trees, there were big trees. And she comes back, and there's more food. Then he realizes what probably is the most important teaching in Buddhism. It's called the middle path, the middle way. He realizes that he's been going at it the wrong way. It's not about extremes. It's not about losing weight and castigating your body, you know, and whipping yourself and fasting and diminishing your body and who you are. Nor is it about indulgence, being a glut, excess. It's all about the middle. It's all about the balance. It's all about striking that balance, avoiding the excesses. That's what it's about. That is a very profound teaching in Buddhism, avoiding the extremes. It's not a new teaching. Aristotle said the same thing in the West. Aristotle said that there are two extremes we often are drawn to in life, excess and deficit. And virtue lies in between. Virtue. You can have too much virtue, you can be a fool, and you can be a coward. You see? Excess, deficit. True virtue. You can be too honest to a fault, or you can be deceitful. Your physician can be bluntly honest with you and tell you you have this condition without any kind of compassion or sensitivity. He's honest, but he has not practiced the virtue of honesty. Or he can be deceitful. See? Aristotle hit that same vein that Buddha touched upon hundreds of years before that. About 100 years before that, not too much before that. So that time in history, 3rd, 4th, 5th century BC. So the middle way, that's the key teaching in Buddhism. Here's a famous story. And to illustrate that, there's a monk by the name of Sona. And the monk plays music. And the Buddha is trying to explain his middle way to the monk. And he says, now, what do you think, Sona, when the strings of your lute become too tight? Do you get the right tune? No. Well, what about when the strings become too slack? Do you get the right tune? No. Well, if the strings are neither too tight nor too slack, but keyed to an even pitch, what about then? Is it the right tune? Yes, indeed. Even so, Sona, too much zeal conduces to restlessness. Too much slackness conduces to sloth, laziness. So saying, the master admonished the young monk to strike a balance between these two extremes and develop an even tempo of spiritual equilibrium. It's all about balance. Let's say a few things about Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism is another chapter in this book. And here we talk about Buddhism from a much more extreme point of view. The Zen Buddhist monk, the Zen Buddhist who now says, you know, whatever the Buddha taught you, get rid of it. Whatever you read in the sutras, get rid of it. Because these are just tools. Let's not become attached to the teachings. If you meet the Buddha on the road, ignore him. In fact, the Buddha was never a Buddhist. That sound strange? Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, was never a Christian. There's something about IST and something about ISM, ists and isms. Buddhism, just like Hinduism, just like Confucianism, these are systems that were elaborated upon after the teacher had gone. See? That's another example of how we have to be careful not to be attached to the teachings, because the teachings themselves are systematic, elaborate doctrinal exercises and interpretations of the followers of the teacher. So we will always have a discrepancy and a conflict between what we think the Buddha actually said, Jesus actually said, Muhammad actually said, and what others think Jesus, Muhammad, Maimonides actually said. You see? There'll always be that conflict. Zen Buddhists, Zen originated in what country? Japan. Zen is a Japanese word. It means meditation. Zen, however, etymologically comes from the Chinese word Chan, C-H-A-N, Chan, which means meditation. Chan comes from the Sanskrit word dhyana, D-H-Y-A-N-A. Do you see the etymological similarities? Dhyana, Chan, Zen. Dhyana in Sanskrit means meditation. So the emphasis in dhyana, Chan, Zen, is meditation. Meditation. When Zen became much more popular or influential in Japan, when it came to Japan, came to Japan as Zen, not Chan, when Chan came to Japan, two groups of people found this incredibly attractive. Two groups of people. Do you know who they were? Who were they? Monks. Monks found this very useful because the monks could find in Zen a discipline, a way to teach mental discipline. Right? Also, another group, warriors. Two groups of people, monks and the warriors. The warriors also found in Zen a way for them to learn how to control the mind. Not only that, but Zen offered them a way to think about life and death in very concrete, practical terms. Namely, for the warrior, at that time in Japanese history, combat was life and death. When you entered combat, there was no in-between. It was life and death, which meant mental control, but which also meant losing attachment. Again, we go back to attachment. Losing attachment to what? What is it that the warrior has to become free from? death, the fear of death. There is no more vicious, more incredibly ferocious warrior than one who has nothing to lose. You know? So the warriors found that as long as their minds were fixed on questions like, how should I defend myself? I don't want to die. How am I going to escape? What do I do now? The mind becomes fixed. And once the mind is fixed, then the warrior is undone. Here is the advice of Takuan Soho, famous Zen master. And he's writing to Yagyu Munenori, who is a famous swordsman. And he is very practical. The monk is warning Yagyu of the danger involved in stopping the mind. It's called stopping the mind. Stopping the mind is when right now you're looking at me and you're just looking at me and thinking, does he really know what he's talking about? What am I doing here? Stuff like that. See, you're stopping the mind. Or you're thinking, oh God, when is he going to be done? I've got lunch, you know, or dinner tonight. What are we having for dinner? You know, that's stopping the mind, right? It means basically an absence of presence. Presence is being there. The toughest thing in the world is to be where we are when we're there, especially when the other person's on a cell phone. So, Yagyu is advised this by Takuan Soho. When you first notice the sword that is moving to strike you, if you think of meeting that sword just as it is, your mind will stop at the sword in just that position. Your own movements will then be undone, and you'll be cut down by your opponent. This is what stopping means. You see, so for the warriors, Zen was ultimately as practically useful, because it enables warriors to be free from their fears, or not free from fears, but not be fixed by them, paralyzed by them. And again, that goes back to attachment. Letting go the fear, letting go the idea, being there in the moment. I put flyers in the back, by the way, about a class I'm giving in the spring at the college. And it's on Zen Buddhism and the martial arts, because I practiced martial arts for many years. I used to teach it. And the whole point in there is that Zen Buddhism is not about breaking bricks. In fact, if anything, it's all about losing your ego. It's all about getting rid of ego and reconnecting with yourself. So there's if you're more than welcome to come to my class. You don't have to pay or anything. Just sit in any time. So if you're interested, there's information back there. You don't have to go through hoops and sign up. But that's the attachment. Zen Buddhism allows us to be free, hopefully, from attachment, because our most important enemy is not the other. It goes back to I again. Who's the enemy? It's our mind. It's not the other. It's my mind. That's my enemy. Mind can be like a wild elephant raging through the forest. This is the image in the Dhammapada, the Buddhist text. It can knock down all the trees, or we can tame the elephant. Let's now look at Taoism. And Taoism, as we know, is Chinese, right? Chinese. Pronounce the T like a D. Taoism. Taoism is based upon the principle of Tao. That's pretty simple. Tao, which means the way. Tao literally means path, the road. It's the way of the universe. It's the way of life. Every one of us here, we follow our own Tao. Our own Tao. Right? Problems come about when we get off the path and we follow someone else's Tao. But we're urged by Taoists to be in touch with our own path. We follow our own path. That's the only path that'll take us anywhere, is our own Tao. And one of my favorite teachings in Taoism is a principle called Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-Y, Wu Wei. And I talk about it to some degree in my book, describing Wu Wei in terms of the characterology or the ideograms of Wu Wei. Now, let me ask you, what is harder, what is more powerful, rock or water? Water. See, we're wise. My students would say, well, rocks, of course. And to a degree, they're right, because if I take a rock and I throw it at the window, I'd shatter it. If I took a cup of water and went like that, it would make no effect on the window, right? But you're absolutely right. Water is, in the long term, much more powerful than rock. Why? Because the rock does what it does. It yields. It follows its Tao. It follows its way. That's the nature of water, is to yield. If I have a bowl of water, put my hand in, the water will yield to my hand. And that precisely, that yielding, is the power of the water. See, the yielding. We see this in the martial arts. We see this in judo. Judo literally means gentle way. But if you've watched judo, it doesn't seem too gentle. It's called gentle way because it's all about using the other person's force against them and knowing the timing. So it's not so much that you conquered the other person, it's that you've somehow used the other person's force against him. And he's defeated himself. You see? That's judo. Yielding. If you look at Sung Dynasty paintings, what's the most common theme in Sung Dynasty paintings in China? It's the waterfall. It's the waterfall. And what's the idea behind the waterfall? The Chinese, there's Wu Wei. Wu Wei literally means non-action. Non-action. Not non-action in the sense of just being standing still, but non-necessary action. Non-unnecessary action. See, non-aggressiveness. The two characters, Wu Wei. Wu, if you look at the character of Wu, you have a bunch of men who are putting out a fire. They're annihilating a fire. That's what the character represents. If you look at the character for Wei, you have a female monkey frantically scratching her belly. She doesn't stop. She's scratching her stomach the entire time. So it's frantic behavior, see? So putting the two together, you have non-action. Non-action. That's a very fundamental principle in Taoism. I'll end with Confucianism, and then we can have some questions. Confucianism. I start off my chapter in Confucianism with the story again, and I'll read the story. It's a story of the 46 Ronin. Have you heard of that? 46 Ronin? Sometimes it's called the 47 Ronin, but it's actually 46. On an early snowy morning in December 1702, 46 samurai of the late Lord Asano Naganori stole into a heavily guarded castle and assassinated its owner, Lord Kira. They then carried his head to Sengakuji, the Buddhist temple where Asano was buried. To appease Asano's soul, they washed the head of Kira and offered it before Asano's grave. In this way, they vindicated his death. So do you see what happened on that morning? They sail into the castle. They go right to the back room. Castles in Japan are constructed in such a way, by the way, that the wood creaks. Wood creaks if anyone is invading that part of the castle. If you go to visit a castle in Japan, well, they somehow manage to get into the inner part of the castle. They go right to the lord of the castle. They kill him. They offer him to kill himself, but he doesn't, so they kill him. And they take his head off. They bring his head gruesomely. They bring it to the graveyard where their lord is buried, and they offer it to the soul. Now, what brought this on? Well, 2 years earlier, Asano was ordered, their lord was ordered by the Tokugawa's strong armed military government, the Bakufu, to commit seppuku, ritual disembowelment, for boldly drawing his sword and injuring Kira inside Shogun Tsuneyoshi's castle in Edo. So their lord was insulted. Their lord drew his sword, violating the law. He then was ordered to commit seppuku, which is ritual disembowelment. Something I always threaten to do in front of my students at the end of each semester. Someday I might do that. I hope not. In the eyes of Asano's samurai, justice was not fairly meted out, so they resolved to avenge their lord. After paying homage at the temple, they then surrendered themselves to the authorities without a struggle. Their detention lasted nearly 2 years. All 46 ronin were finally sentenced to commit seppuku, and their remains were buried at Sengakuji. Now, when I was in Tokyo some years ago, and I go there every few years, Tokyo is an amazing place. Number one, you have over 30 million people in Tokyo, right? Manhattan's 9 million, not between 9 and 10. So just think of that, right? And you have these incredibly tall buildings, but you have these little alleys where you have Buddhist temples. And these Buddhist temples are very popular. And I went to visit Sengakuji, which is where the 46 ronins remain. They remain. They're. So it's a very hot tourist spot, unfortunately, but you light incense, you pay some money, and you go in to see the museum and all that. But the Japanese, to this day, they really are amazed. They think of the 46 ronin as heroes because they vindicated their master. But they were imprisoned for 2 years. And why was this the case? Well, because the question is, okay, they're guilty. They killed Kira. What should we do with them? So you had this interesting debate among Confucian scholars as to what to do with the ronin. There's one saying in Confucius, and the saying is this. It's not a fortune cookie saying. I don't think you'll find this in a fortune cookie. The master says, no man should live under the same sky as his father's murderer. No man should live under the same sky as his father's murderer, which means someone kills my father. I owe it to him to kill his murderer. And that's what the 46 ronin must have felt part of that, because their master was also their father, you see. And they therefore felt duty-bound to vindicate the death of their master. Other Confucians looked at it differently. Confucianism also tells us that private interests should never supersede the common good. Private interests should never supersede the common good. In fact, we find that theme throughout Confucianism. That's the most important theme in Confucianism, is that when it comes to my own private interests, the public well-being trumps that. What I want, what I desire, what I need, it might be important to me, but what's more important is what my family wants, or what the state wants, or what the community wants, what's good for the community. You see? So this is why the Confucians were kind of in a dilemma, wondering what to do. Because let's face it, the 46 samurai took the law into their own hands. Right? They acted in a way which may have vindicated their lord, but it was purely out of self-interest. They broke the law. And the law is there to protect public order. The law is there for a reason. So they were finally ordered to commit seppuku, one by one. First the junior, and then the senior. One by one, to take their own lives. Ritual disembowelment. A very messy day, that day. 46 ronin. Which was a compromise. because ordinary criminals were to be decapitated, brought out outside the city, kneel on the dirty ground, and be decapitated. Now, I don't know what was more ignominious, having your head cut off or kneeling on the dirt, but it was pretty bad. You're outside the city. They were not decapitated. They were instructed to commit seppuku, which was a compromise, you see, compromise when you look at Confucian teachings. But bear in mind, the most important Confucian teaching is that of common good should always trump individual self-interests. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Thank you.